Every major US war crime in 20 minutes by the Paint Explainer. Oh man, we all know the US is not the cleanest country. We all know they have their sins, including enslaving a certain race of people that essentially built up their country and is a large reason of why it's so big today. But they don't want to talk about that. But anyway, what is going on in the US? They need to be coming down. Even this new Iran war, it's not smart. And now they're gonna add more war crimes to this. Gonna have to make another video to add to it. Here we go.
Kunduz Hospital airstrike. This is one of the most recent ones in the video, as it happened on October 3, 2015. On that day, an American military gunship attacked a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. This was not a military base. It was a trauma center run by the famous aid group Doctors Without Borders. For about 30 minutes, the aircraft circled overhead, firing repeatedly and precisely at the hospital building.
This is just disgusting, bro. Like, why actually do this? Military base is, obviously you don't support war, but that's they're gonna do their thing. Military base, but why a hospital though? It's like the other day when they mistakenly bombed the nursery in Iran. Like, what is going on? US are on some commanders right now, or always have been actually.
The gunship fired 211 shells in total. Inside, the scene was a nightmare. Some patients burned alive in their beds because they could not move. Doctors lost their limbs or were decapitated by shrapnel while trying to operate. As people tried to run from the burning buildings to escape, they were shot from the air. By the time the attack ended, at least 42 people were dead, including doctors, nurses, and patients. The hospital had given its exact GPS coordinates to the
all innocent people, by the way, just trying to live their lives.
US military just days before, specifically to prevent something like this from happening. Even while the bombs were falling, hospital staff were frantically calling military officials, begging them to stop, but the strikes continued. After the attack, the American explanation changed several times. First, officials said they were protecting troops on the ground. Then, they claimed the Afghan army had asked for the strike. Finally, the US commander admitted it was a specific decision made by American forces, but called it a tragic mistake caused by human error and broken equipment. Some officials tried to claim that Taliban fighters were hiding in the hospital, using civilians as human shields. Doctors Without Borders flatly denied this, explaining that they had a strict no-weapons policy and that the compound was full of doctors and patients, not soldiers.
Excuses. Bro, just admit that you guys were evil and did something evil. I did a day. That's what happened. You're just evil, soulless.
In the end, President Obama apologized, and the military punished 16 people with administrative discipline, but no one was ever charged with a crime.
Wow, thanks, Obama. That makes it a lot better. All the people that died. Oh, sorry. Oh, my bad. That brings them back to life. Nice.
The Pentagon concluded that because it was an accident, it was not a war crime. The doctors and the United Nations called for an independent investigation, arguing that a military cannot fairly investigate its own actions, but that investigation never happened. Mahmoudiya killings. On March 12, 2006, in a small house near the village of Yusufia in Iraq, something truly horrific happened. 5 American soldiers from the 502nd Infantry Regiment left their checkpoint and walked to the home of an Iraqi family. The family included a 14-year-old girl called Abir and her 6-year-old sister Hadil and their parents. Their 2 younger brothers were away at school that day. These soldiers had been watching Abir from their nearby checkpoint for some time. They often saw her doing chores in the garden, and some had harassed her before, staring at her or making gestures that scared her family. Her mother had even planned to have Abir sleep at a relative's house to keep her safe. One soldier, Stephen Dale Green, had even touched Abir's face during a house search, which terrified her. Green himself had told a reporter just a month earlier that killing people in Iraq felt like nothing to him, like squashing an ant, and that he had come there wanting to kill. That day, the soldiers were drinking alcohol mixed with energy drinks, playing cards, and talking about doing what can't be said here to Abir and killing Iraqis. Green kept pushing the idea. 4 of them changed their looks to look less like US soldiers, and they headed to the house in broad daylight. Brian L. Howard stayed at the checkpoint, but knew what was planned. They separated the family into different rooms. One of them grabbed the little sister who was outside, while another one shot and killed the parents and the sister. The mother struggled, and her arms were broken. Then, 2 soldiers took turns doing what they had planned to Abir. The soldier who shot the family came in after killing the others, said he had just killed them all, and called it awesome. He then did the same thing as the other 2 soldiers to Abir, and then killed her. To cover it up, they poured petrol on her body and set fire to the lower part apart. The fire spread, and they burned their bloody clothes too, throwing the murder weapon into a canal. Afterwards, they went back and ate chicken wings to celebrate. Neighbors saw the smoke and rushed over. One described seeing the poor girl's body. They told Abir's uncle, who put out some flames to get inside, and saw the terrible scene. The surviving brothers, 9-year-old Ahmed and 11-year-old Mohammed, came home from school to find their house burning and their family gone. They were left orphans, raised by their uncle. The soldiers tried to blame Sunni insurgents at first, and for a while, no one investigated deeply, but the crime led to revenge attacks. Militant groups claimed they kidnapped and killed American soldiers from the same unit to avenge Abir, releasing videos of the bodies. The truth came out months later when another soldier in the unit, Justin Watt, heard about it from others and decided to report it, even though he feared his comrades might hurt him for speaking up. Investigations started, and the soldiers were arrested. Green had already left the army for mental issues, so he was tried in a civilian court. He was found guilty of rape and murder, but got life in prison instead of death because the jury could not agree on the death penalty. He later died in prison by suicide. The others faced military trials. Barker pleaded guilty, admitted hating Iraqis, and got 90 years with possible parole after 10. Cortez also pleaded guilty, apologized in tears for the pain he caused, and got 100 years with possible parole after 10. Spielman was convicted and sentenced to 110 years with possible parole after 10. Howard, who helped cover it up, got 27 months. Another soldier who knew but did not report was discharged. Kanikati Massacre.
All those guys should rot under the jail, bro, and burn in hell forever, man.
American troops had just entered the town of Kanikati in Sicily. The German army had retreated, leaving behind a lot of destruction. So desperate and hungry, local people gathered at a bombed-out factory to take whatever supplies they could find. They were filling buckets with food and liquid soap just to survive the chaos. An American commander named Colonel McCaffrey arrived at the scene. He was supposed to be in charge of keeping order. Instead, when he saw the crowd, he demanded they leave immediately. When the people didn't move fast enough, the colonel ordered his own soldiers to fire into the crowd of unarmed families. But the soldiers refused to shoot, as they saw that these were just civilians. Furious, Colonel McCaffrey pulled out his own handgun and started shooting people himself. He killed at least 8 innocent people, including an 11-year-old girl. The most shocking part is that the colonel got away with it. He was never punished and lived for another decade before dying of natural causes. For years, this massacre was completely forgotten, and the truth only came out because the son of a witness finally decided to tell the world what he had seen. Tiger Force atrocities. The Tiger Force started as a small group of elite soldiers in Vietnam, trained to be fast and deadly. But by May 1967, this unit had turned into something monstrous. The mission was supposed to be about finding guerrilla fighters, but it became something totally different. The commanders wanted high numbers of enemy kills, and one colonel even ordered the troops to reach a specific number of kills to match the unit's name. This created an environment where soldiers felt like they had a license to kill anyone they saw. For 7 months, they went on a rampage where unarmed people were hunted down and killed, even if they weren't guerrilla fighters. The reports from that time describe a nightmare. Soldiers were executing elderly people and women in the rice fields as they begged for their lives. They threw grenades into underground shelters where families were hiding, turning those bunkers into mass graves. Prisoners were tortured and executed routinely. Some soldiers began cutting off the ears of the dead and wearing them on necklaces as trophies. 2 friends from Arizona, Sammy Barra and Ken Green, became the symbols of all of this. After Green was killed in battle, Ibarra went over the edge and started mutilating bodies. Instead of being punished, Ibarra was actually congratulated in a military newspaper for getting the unit's 1,000th kill. Not everyone went along with what was happening, though. A soldier named Gerald Bruner actually pointed his rifle at a fellow soldier to stop a killing, but his commanders treated him like he was the problem. Others who tried to report the crimes were told to keep quiet. One military journalist was threatened with death by his own commander if he spoke up. Even the medical staff suspected what was happening, but were too afraid to investigate. Years later, though, the army actually did investigate. From 1971 to 1975, they gathered sworn statements from soldiers who admitted to the crimes. They found proof of routine murder, including the killing of 2 blind brothers and many civilians. However, in the end, nobody was punished. Some think it was because by 1975 the war was ending, and the government wanted to move on. Likely afraid of a massive scandal, the files were buried. It took decades for reporters to uncover the truth. They went back to Vietnam, found the old grave sites, and spoke to witnesses. Al Hamdaniya murder.
And then why do people have to be so evil, though? Like, you're there for war, it's fine, but why do you have to kill civilians? What do they do for no reason? It's genuinely evil just for no reason.
On April 26, 2006, a group of U.S. Marines went into a small village in Iraq called Al-Hamdaniya, not to fight, but to look for an insurgent. However, when they couldn't find him, they made a decision to just get someone else. There was someone called by the locals as Hashim the Lam, a disabled man who walked with a metal bar in his leg and had poor eyesight. The Marines broke into his house while he was asleep and dragged him away from his family. Before they grabbed him, they stole a shovel and an AK-47 from a neighbor's yard to use as props. They tied the disabled man's hands, forced him to walk to a hole in the road, and shot him to death. To cover their tracks, they fired the stolen gun into the air to make it sound like a battle was happening. Then, they untied his hands, planted the shovel and the rifle next to his body, and filed a false report claiming they had shot a terrorist who was digging a roadside bomb. When his family found him the next morning, he had been shot in the mouth, and his face was so swollen and beaten that he was almost unrecognizable. The truth eventually came out, and 7 Marines and 1 Navy medic were charged with murder and kidnapping. However, the justice system struggled to hold them accountable. Most of the men made deals to testify against each other in exchange for lighter punishments. The leader of the group was convicted of murder and sentenced to 15 years, but that conviction was later overturned due to legal errors. He was retried and convicted again, but in the end, the jury decided he didn't need to serve any more prison time. Gorla Massacre. On October 20th, 1944, children at an elementary school in Milan were running down the stairs toward the air raid shelter while bombs were being dropped on the city when a sudden explosion caused a tragedy. At the time, Milan was heavily bombed because it was one of Italy's most important industrial cities, and its factories were useful for supporting the war. The 451st Bombing Group of the 15th Air Force was assigned to bomb Milan, even though it was known to have a poor record, since earlier in the war, planes from the same group had accidentally bombed the town of Venafro, killing 40 Italian civilians and 17 Allied soldiers. Although they were investigated and criticized, no officers were punished because commanders feared it would hurt morale in future operations. Nonetheless, on the morning of October 20th, 1944, 111 American bombers took off from southern Italy. 2 bomber groups hit their assigned targets, and then it was the 451st Bombing Group's turn. They were supposed to strike the Breda factory. The lead aircraft made a fatal navigation mistake. Instead of turning left toward the target, it turned right, sending the bombers directly over the densely populated neighborhoods of Gorla and Prakoto. Realizing they could no longer reach the factory, the lead plane still dropped its bombs and ordered the others to do the same. All the bombs from the second wave fell on civilian areas. This attack, later known as the Gorla Massacre, killed about 614 civilians. Among the dead were 184 children who were inside the Francesco Crispi primary school when the bombs hit. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier, but many people didn't have enough time to reach shelters. After the bombing, there was internal criticism of the 451st Bombing Group, but there were no real consequences. No one was punished, and Milan was devastated. The children came to be known as the Little Martyrs of Gorla. Fascist authorities used the bombing for propaganda, calling the Allies murderers of children. Thuibo killings. On January 31st, Company H of the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines approached the small village of Thuibo at midday. Suddenly, they came under heavy fire, including from a .50 caliber machine gun. Pinned down, their captain, Edward Banks, called in airstrikes and artillery and asked for reinforcements. Even with help, though, they could not advance and stayed under fire until nightfall. At first light the next morning, the company pushed into the village. What happened next is where the stories split apart. Vietnamese communist sources say it was a massacre, and a village memorial lists 145 civilians killed, mostly women, children, and elderly men. U.S. sources, on the other hand, say 22 civilians died during 2 days of combat. The Marines reported 5 dead and 26 wounded in their own ranks, an estimated 101 Viet Cong killed. Captain Banks said it was impossible to tell who was enemy and who was friend. He claimed villagers sometimes watched booby traps go off without warning Marines. Overall, he described the mission as a search and destroy operation and denied a massacre. He insisted the Viet Cong used human shields and argued that, at most, 10 to 15 civilians may have been killed during the assault. He said he shouted for his men to stop firing when the enemy's fire ended. Some of his men, though, remembered things differently. Marine Jack Hill said the number of dead was ridiculous for a village they had thought was friendly. He said that the next day their orders were to sweep the village. Hill described forcing people from hiding by throwing grenades into bunkers. He explained that the language barrier and the pressure of war had a role in those choices. Villagers told yet other versions. A 14-year-old said jets and artillery struck first, then troops came, asked if if people were Viet Cong and shot them. Others said only women, children, and old men were present, and that short bursts of gunfire cut them down while they ate or pressed sugarcane. One woman said a grenade thrown into her house killed 10 family members and that soldiers fired again into the corpses. Another said that a neighbor who had just given birth was killed, and her baby too, in a brutal way. One villager said babies clung to dead mothers' bodies when the shooting stopped, and that the living carried corpses to nearby posts to demand the killing end. Some said Marines later ordered them to dig up buried bodies to look for Viet Cong. When asked about claims that women and children were forced into a shelter and a grenade thrown inside, Hill said he could not confirm it. He described mass confusion and crying. The Marines battalion reviewed the 22 corpses and 18 wounded people brought to their command post and called these deaths an unfortunate side effect of the battle. Villagers insisted many were executed at close range after the Viet Cong had already left. The numbers remain disputed. Biscari Massacre.
Those Americans are definitely lying, bro. It was definitely way more than 22, the way they were going crazy. Damn, you cannot never trust these guys. Always will save their own backs. Oh, there was confusion. Any excuse to dodge the bills and accountability.
On July 14, 1943, during the invasion of Sicily, American soldiers, in 2 separate incidents on the same day, executed 73 prisoners of war. In the first incident, a sergeant named Horace West was ordered to take a group of prisoners to the rear. Instead, he marched them about a mile away and stopped. He borrowed a Tommy gun and told his fellow American guards to turn away if they did not want to watch what he was about to do. He then opened fire on the unarmed men. Investigators later found that he had shot them through the heart. The most chilling detail is that after his gun ran empty, West reloaded it and walked among the bodies, shooting the wounded men who were still moving to make sure they were dead. 37 bodies were left lying on the ground. Later that same day, a captain named John Compton was angry because snipers had been shooting at his men. When his troops captured a group of 36 Italians who were hiding in a ditch, they brought them to the captain. The prisoners begged for their lives, but the captain gave a direct order to a firing squad. He told his men he did not want anyone left standing. When the prisoners tried to run, the Americans opened fire and killed all of them. When the news reached the top commanders, at first, the famous General George Patton tried to cover it up. He wrote in his diary that they should just lie and say the men were snipers killed in combat to avoid a scandal. However, other officers refused to stay silent, and Patton himself, once he learned the details, that the prisoners had offered no provocation and were essentially being slaughtered, said, "Try those bastards." Both the sergeant and the captain were put on trial. The sergeant was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, while the captain was found not guilty, claiming he was just following orders. Soldiers claimed that those orders came from Patton himself, who, according to their versions, said not to take prisoners if enemy combatants continued to resist within 200 yards of their position. The story has a shocking ending. The sergeant never actually served his life sentence. After the noise died down, the army quietly released him a year later. He was allowed to return to duty and was eventually given an honorable discharge. Torture in Operation Teardrop.
Man, corruption everywhere, bro. Corruption everywhere. He deserved to rot and die under the jail, and of course he gets to go back like nothing happened.
It was the final weeks of World War II, and a terrifying rumor was spreading through the US military. Leaders believed that German submarines were crossing the Atlantic, carrying flying bombs or rockets aimed directly at New York City. The mayor of New York had even warned the public that attacks were coming. In response, the US Navy launched a massive mission called Operation Teardrop to hunt down these boats before they could reach the coast. The fighting in the North Atlantic was brutal. During the battle, a German submarine named U-546 managed to sink an American destroyer, killing most of the crew. The Americans responded with fury, hunting the German boat for 10 hours until they forced it to the surface and sank it. They pulled 33 German survivors from the water, including the captain, Paul Just. However, instead of treating them like normal prisoners of war, the Americans were driven by panic. They needed to know if more submarines were coming with missiles. They separated 8 specific crew members, labeled them as specialists, and took them to a base in Newfoundland. There, the interrogators used what they called shock interrogation. They threw the men into solitary confinement, beat them, and forced them to do exhausting physical exercises until they broke. The treatment was so harsh that the German captain eventually collapsed unconscious. This torture continued even after the war in Europe had officially ended. Historians later described this as a singular atrocity. The tragedy is that it was all for nothing. After the war, investigators confirmed that the submarines never carried any missiles. The weapons that the Americans were so afraid of did not exist on those boats. Kandahar Massacre. During the war in Afghanistan, on an ordinary night, families went to sleep as usual, but they were suddenly woken by flashlights and gunfire. What happened is that on March 11, 2012, U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Robert Bales walked into Afghan villages before dawn. U.S. investigators concluded that he didn't leave the base just once, but twice that night. First going to Al-Qazai, where he killed 4 and wounded 6, and then to Najiban, where he killed 12, including most of one family. Witnesses said some victims were pulled from sleep and shot in the head. They also described a woman dragged and beaten and more graphic stuff, which we won't go into detail for obvious reasons. In one home, bodies were gathered into a room and set on fire. By the end, Bales had murdered 16 civilians, 9 of which were children, and 11 came from the same family. Bales returned to his base later that morning and said, "I did it." Afghan officials called it intentional murder, and
Like, seriously, people like this actually have to be like demons in human form. Generally, how could you do this? Like, what's going in your brain? Bro, actually has animal demons among us, bro.
the US and NATO issued apologies. Protests erupted, and the Afghan parliament demanded a public trial in Kabul, but US officials said he would be tried under American military law. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and he was also reduced to the lowest rank, dishonorably discharged, and stripped of all pay and benefits. Dachau Liberation Reprisals. On April 29, 1945, American soldiers reached the Dachau concentration camp, and they walked into a nightmare. This was not just a normal military target. They found train cars packed with thousands of skeletons, bodies piled from the floor to the ceiling, and survivors who were starving and barely alive. Just days before, the guards had forced thousands of prisoners on a death march. The American soldiers were shocked and furious, and in that atmosphere, discipline completely collapsed. What happened next is known as the Dachau Reprisals. Enraged American soldiers and the liberated prisoners themselves began killing the German SS guards. Historians estimate that between 35 and 50 guards were killed that day. The killings happened in chaos. One American commander, Colonel Felix Sparks, later described a moment in a coal yard where a machine gunner opened fire on surrendered prisoners. Sparks ran over and physically stopped the gunner, but about a dozen men were already dead. In other parts of the camp, guards were shot near walls and guard towers without any trial. At the same time, the prisoners took their own revenge. They swarmed the guards, beating them with shovels, sticks, and their bare fists, or stomping them to death. In many cases, the American soldiers stood by and watched, deliberately looking the other way. The U.S. Army actually investigated these killings immediately. A report confirmed that surrendered guards had been shot and that wounded men were left without medical care. Serious charges were considered, even against officers. However, General George Patton, the same general we talked about in the Biscari massacre, dismissed the case. The legal review argued that because
This George guy deserves a bang in the head. Bro will always escape the bills just because he's high up in the waist in the army.
the horrors discovered at Dachau were so extreme, it was unjust to punish the soldiers for snapping. In the end, no one was ever punished. Lipach Massacre. On April 22, 1945, near the German village of Lipach, American soldiers committed a brutal war crime that is rarely discussed. The day began with a harsh battle. American tanks attacked a group of German SS troops who held them off for hours with rockets and artillery. The Americans eventually broke through, but the real horror began after the main battle was over. While the rest of the army moved on, a smaller unit of American soldiers stayed behind in the village. They discovered a warehouse full of alcohol, and many of them got drunk. According to accounts, about 25 of these intoxicated soldiers then turned their rage on the prisoners they had captured. In total, 36 German soldiers died, and historians believe about 16 of them were executed after they had already surrendered. The details of the killings are gruesome. 10 prisoners were marched out to a meadow and shot in the back of the head. 6 others had their skulls crushed. What makes this even more shocking is who these victims were. The German soldiers were incredibly young, with an average age of just 16. They were essentially teenagers. The violence did not stop with the executions. The same group of American soldiers is accused of raping around 20 women in the village that same night. These crimes happened during the chaotic final rush to win the war, and there was no real accountability at the time. If you want to discuss this video,
But man, that is a heavy video, honestly. So many war crimes, so many atrocities, and most people will actually never know about them because, especially, they just like to cover everything up. And there's definitely way more that will probably never see the light of day that we'll never know about. But yeah, it's a sad one. Like, subscribe, and all that good stuff.